Welcome. Tonight's story comes from a time when cruelty was law and silence meant survival. This is the story of an elderly, enslaved woman who was humiliated in front of everyone, mocked, shamed, and treated as if she were less than human. But what happened next left hardened men trembling. A massive alpha wolf stepped out of the woods, and nothing on that plantation was ever the same. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I truly want to see how far these stories travel. And please subscribe, because every episode you see here is built on hours of deep research, true historical digging, and careful fact-finding to bring forgotten stories back into the light. On plantations, hierarchy was not just understood, it was performed daily. Power had to be seen to be believed. At the top stood the owner, often distant but absolute in authority. Beneath him were overseers and foremen, men hired not just to manage labor, but to enforce fear. And at the bottom were the enslaved, stripped of rights, identity, and protection under the law. Every movement, every breath, operated within this rigid structure. The system depended on visible dominance, because once fear weakened, control could fracture. Public humiliation was one of the foreman's most effective tools. Physical punishment left scars, but humiliation sank deeper. It broke pride, isolated individuals, and sent a message to everyone watching: this could be you. Workers were often singled out for minor or fabricated mistakes, accused of laziness, disobedience, or incompetence, not because productivity had truly suffered, but because authority required constant reinforcement. The spectacle mattered more than the truth. These humiliations were carefully staged. They happened in open fields, near barns, or in central yard spaces where others were forced to witness. The goal was psychological containment. When one person was shamed, dozens absorbed the warning. Heads lowered, eyes avoided contact. Silence became self-protection. The hierarchy fed on that silence, using it as proof of submission. Elderly enslaved individuals occupied a particularly vulnerable place within this system. Age reduced physical output, and in a structure that valued bodies only for labor, slowing down could be treated as defiance. Instead of being respected for endurance and survival, elders were often mocked for weakness. Their years of suffering earned no mercy. In fact, their age sometimes made them easier targets, less likely to fight back physically, less likely to flee. Foreman understood that humiliating an elder carried symbolic weight. It demonstrated that no one, no matter how long they had endured, was beyond control. If even the oldest could be degraded publicly, then hope for dignity diminished for everyone else. It was a calculated strategy: crush the figure that might quietly inspire resilience, and the rest would remain compliant. Language itself became a weapon in this hierarchy. Insults were shouted loudly, designed to strip identity and replace it with labels meant to dehumanize. Being called useless, burden, or property in front of others was meant to reshape how a person saw themselves. Over time, repeated humiliation could distort self-worth, turning survival into mere obedience. The system relied on this internal erosion as much as it relied on force, but hierarchy maintained through humiliation was never truly stable. It required constant reinforcement, because it was built on fear rather than respect. Every public shaming was both a demonstration of power and an admission of insecurity, proof that authority needed to be theatrically asserted. And sometimes, in rare and unexpected moments, that carefully constructed structure could tremble when confronted with something it did not control. Psychological control was often more powerful than physical punishment because it reshaped how a person understood themselves. On plantations, shame was not accidental, it was deliberate strategy. Enslavers understood that if they could make someone feel small, incapable, or worthless, they would not need constant violence to maintain order. A person who doubted their own value was less likely to resist. Shame became an invisible chain, tightening quietly around the mind. Humiliation worked by isolating the individual from the group. When someone was publicly mocked or degraded, others were forced to watch but not react. That silence created emotional distance. The victim stood alone, not just physically but socially. Over time, this isolation weakened bonds of solidarity. People learned that showing sympathy could make them the next target. So they protected themselves by appearing indifferent, even when they were not. The language used during these moments was carefully chosen to attack identity. Words like useless, slow, or stupid were repeated until they began to echo internally. Constant verbal degradation could distort self-perception. When insults are heard daily, especially in a system where there is no counter, voice of affirmation, they begin to feel like truth. Psychological control depended on repetition, the steady erosion of confidence through words. Shame also functioned as a warning to everyone else. Each public humiliation reinforced the boundaries of acceptable behavior. It taught the group what not to do, how not to stand, how not to speak. The fear of embarrassment became preventative discipline. Even without direct supervision, many would self-correct out of anxiety. In this way, humiliation extended the foreman's control far beyond his physical presence. Another layer of psychological control was unpredictability. If punishment or humiliation came without clear reason, it created constant tension. People could not prepare or defend themselves because the rules shifted according to the mood of authority. This uncertainty heightened stress and hyper-awareness. Living in that state of constant alertness drained emotional strength and reinforced dependence on avoiding attention. Over time, shame could alter posture, speech, and even eye contact. Many learned to make themselves appear smaller, lowering their gaze, speaking softly, moving carefully, as a survival response. These physical behaviors reflected internal adaptation. The body mirrored the psychological pressure. The system sought not just obedience, but visible submission that confirmed its dominance. Yet psychological control through shame was never completely absolute. Even under layers of humiliation, some individuals maintained an inner sense of self that could not be fully erased. Silence did not always mean agreement. Lowered eyes did not always mean broken spirit. The strategy of shame aimed to conquer the mind, but deep within, dignity could survive, waiting for a moment when fear loosened its grip. Her resistance was not loud. It did not come in the form of shouting or striking back. It lived in something quieter, in the way she held her posture when ordered to bend, in the way her eyes remained steady when others looked away. On a plantation where survival often depended on appearing submissive, even the smallest refusal carried weight. Choosing not to kneel immediately, choosing not to beg, choosing not to collapse under insult. These were subtle acts, but they disrupted expectations. For an elderly enslaved woman, resistance required a different kind of strength. Her body had endured decades of forced labor, punishment, hunger, and exhaustion. She knew the consequences of open defiance. She had likely witnessed brutal retaliation against those who challenged authority directly. So her resistance adapted. It became controlled, measured, internal. She understood that surviving long enough to grow old in such a system was itself a form of quiet rebellion. Her silence was not emptiness. It was deliberate. When the foreman hurled insults meant to provoke tears or apologies, she did not offer him that satisfaction. Silence denied him emotional victory. It forced him to confront a presence that would not crumble theatrically. In systems built on dominance, humiliation works best when the victim visibly breaks. By remaining composed, she disrupted the script he expected to perform. There was also dignity in the way she stood. Years of hardship had not erased her sense of self. Even if the world around her denied her humanity, she carried memory. Memory of who she was before enslavement, memory of family, memory of identity. That internal archive could not be confiscated. When she remained upright, she was not just refusing a command. She was protecting that inner history from being erased in front of witnesses. Her resistance extended beyond herself. Others were watching, younger workers, newly enslaved individuals, those who had not yet learned how to shield their emotions. They observed her stillness. In that moment, she modeled endurance without surrender. She showed that submission of the body did not always require submission of the spirit. Even if no one spoke of it aloud, such moments could plant seeds of quiet courage. This kind of resistance required immense emotional discipline. Fear would have been natural. The threat of punishment was real and immediate. Yet she controlled her breathing, her movements, her expression. That composure was not weakness, it was mastery over instinct. She understood that panic empowered the oppressor. Calmness unsettled him. It shifted the emotional balance, even if only slightly. Silent resistance may not rewrite laws or topple structures overnight, but it preserves something essential: selfhood. By refusing to internalize humiliation, she safeguarded her identity in a place designed to strip it away. Her stance said, without words, that while her body might be controlled, her core remained her own. And in a system dependent on total domination, that quiet ownership of self was a powerful act. The other enslaved workers understood immediately what was happening, even before the foreman raised his voice. There was a shift in the air whenever someone was singled out. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Tools slowed. Eyes lowered almost in unison. It was a survival reflex learned over years. Do not draw attention. Do not become visible. Do not become next. Witnessing humiliation was not passive. It was a tense, calculated act of self-preservation. Fear among the witnesses operated on multiple levels. There was the immediate fear of physical punishment if they reacted improperly. A glance held too long, a sigh interpreted as defiance, a step taken forward in defense. But there was also a deeper fear, the reminder that their own safety was fragile and conditional. Watching someone else being degraded reinforced how easily their own stability could collapse. Silence became their shield. Even when sympathy stirred inside them, it had to remain hidden. Showing emotion could be dangerous. A tightened jaw, a tear, or a muttered word could be interpreted as solidarity, and solidarity threatened the hierarchy. So they trained themselves to appear detached. This outward stillness masked an internal storm of anger, helplessness, and anxiety. The fear was contagious. When one person stiffened, others mirrored the tension. The entire group absorbed the psychological shock together, even though no one acknowledged it. This collective suppression created a heavy atmosphere, thick with unspoken thoughts. Every insult hurled at the elderly woman echoed through the group as a warning. The humiliation was directed at one, but its impact spread to all. Some of the younger workers may have felt a particular confusion. They were still learning the unwritten rules of survival. Seeing an elder, someone who had endured so much, being publicly shamed could destabilize their sense of order. If even she was not safe from ridicule, then what protection did time or obedience truly offer? That realization deepened their unease. There was also guilt woven into the fear. Many likely wished, even briefly, that they could intervene, but the cost was too high. Survival demanded restraint. Over time, repeatedly choosing self-preservation over defense of others could weigh heavily on the conscience. Yet within that system, such choices were not moral failures. They were necessary adaptations to oppression. Despite their silence, witnessing left a mark. Moments like these were remembered long after the fieldwork ended for the day. They were discussed in whispers at night, or replayed privately in the mind. Fear kept them outwardly still, but internally, each event reshaped how they understood power, vulnerability, and endurance. The hierarchy depended on their fear, but it could never fully control what they thought once the sun went down. Before the wolf was seen, it was felt. The first sign was subtle, a shift in the wind that carried a different scent through the field. The air, once heavy with dust and sweat, turned sharp and cool. Leaves along the tree line began to tremble, not violently, but with a steady ripple that did not match the stillness of the sky. It was the kind of change that animals notice before humans do. The horses reacted next. Tied near the fence, they lifted their heads at the same time, ears angled forward, nostrils flaring. One stomped the ground, pulling slightly against the rope. Another released a low, uneasy sound. Animals living close to survival instincts sense predators quickly. Their agitation cut through the tension already hanging over the field, adding a new layer of uncertainty. Even the birds shifted. Moments earlier, distant chirping had blended into the background of the plantation's routine noise. Suddenly, the sound scattered. Wings fluttered upward from the trees in a quick burst, followed by abrupt silence. Nature does not quiet without reason. That silence felt unnatural, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The workers felt it too, though many could not explain what exactly had changed. A prickling sensation crawled across skin, the kind of awareness that travels through the body without permission. Some may have glanced toward the woods instinctively, drawn by something they couldn't name. It was not yet fear of the wolf. It was anticipation of something unknown. The foreman, absorbed in his display of dominance, may not have noticed at first. His voice still carried sharply across the field. But even his tone shifted slightly when the environment stopped responding the way it normally did. Sound travels differently in silence, without birds or wind to swallow his words. His shouting seemed exposed, almost hollow. Dust swirled lightly near the ground, tracing invisible currents of air. The edge of the forest appeared darker than before, shadows stretching longer as if thickening. Light filtered unevenly through the trees, creating patches of brightness and sudden dimness. The boundary between cultivated land and wild nature felt more pronounced, like a line being drawn. By the time the wolf stepped into view, the atmosphere had already prepared everyone for its arrival. The environmental shift acted as a warning, a transition from human control to something older and untamed. It was as though the land itself signaled that the balance of power was about to be interrupted, and when the figure finally emerged from the woods, it did not feel random, it felt inevitable. The alpha wolf carried meaning far beyond its physical presence. In the natural world, an alpha represents leadership, protection, and authority earned through strength and instinct rather than imposed through cruelty. Unlike the plantation hierarchy, which was built on forced dominance, the wolf's position in its pack depended on balance, guarding territory, ensuring survival, and maintaining order. Its appearance introduced a different model of power into a space ruled by fear. To the witnesses, the wolf's size and composure immediately set it apart from ordinary wildlife. It did not creep or scavenge. It stepped forward deliberately, head level, shoulders steady, eyes focused. That calm confidence signaled control. An alpha does not rush without reason. It calculates, it observes. In contrast to the foreman's loud humiliation tactics, the wolf's authority required no shouting. Symbolically, the wolf represented untamed nature, a force outside human systems of oppression. The plantation was designed to project ownership over land, labor, and life. Yet the forest bordering it remained unconquered. The wolf emerging from those woods was a reminder that not everything could be dominated. There were boundaries beyond which plantation power did not extend. In many cultural traditions, wolves are seen as guardians or spiritual messengers. Whether or not the witnesses consciously framed it that way, the timing of its arrival felt significant. It stepped between cruelty and vulnerability at the precise moment tension peaked. That positioning transformed it from animal to symbol, a barrier against humiliation, a silent challenger to enforced hierarchy. The wolf's gaze played a crucial role in shifting power. It locked onto the foreman, not the workers. Predators assess threats carefully, and by fixing its attention on the loudest aggressor, it reversed the dynamic. The man who had commanded fear moments earlier now stood under scrutiny. The absence of snarling or lunging made the moment even more unsettling. Controlled stillness can be more intimidating than open attack. There was also symbolic contrast in posture. The foreman relied on raised hands, shouted words, and physical intimidation to assert dominance. The wolf stood grounded, balanced, unmoving. One form of authority was constructed through humiliation. The other was embodied naturally. That visual comparison would not have been lost on those watching. It exposed how fragile, loud dominance can appear when confronted by quiet strength. Ultimately, the alpha wolf symbolized a disruption of imposed order. It did not overthrow the system. nor did it remain long enough to rewrite rules. But its presence fractured the illusion that the plantation hierarchy was absolute. For a brief moment, power shifted without a single human word spoken. And in that silent exchange, the idea of dominance itself was challenged by something older, steadier, and beyond control. The reversal of power did not happen with violence, it happened with stillness. Just moments earlier, the foreman controlled the rhythm of the field, his voice cutting through the air, his posture commanding obedience, his insults shaping the emotional climate. Everyone responded to him, but when the wolf stepped forward and held its ground, that rhythm broke. Silence replaced shouting. Attention shifted. Control moved away from the man who believed he owned it. Power on the plantation had always flowed in one direction, downward. Orders were given, heads bowed, punishment enforced. That structure depended on predictability. The foreman expected fear, expected trembling, expected submission. Instead, he found himself frozen. His raised hand slowly lowered, not because someone told him to stop, but because something in front of him demanded caution. For the first time in that moment, he reacted rather than commanded. The workers witnessed something rare, a hesitation in authority. Even a brief pause was significant. The foreman's confidence, once loud and performative, became visibly uncertain. His body stiffened. His steps halted. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Power, which had felt solid minutes earlier, now appeared fragile. And when dominance hesitates, its illusion cracks. The elderly woman's position within this reversal was equally powerful. She no longer stood alone under scrutiny. The wolf placed itself between her and humiliation, creating a physical and symbolic barrier. Without speaking, it redefined the space. She was no longer the spectacle, the foreman was. All eyes that had once watched her now observed him, measuring his reaction, noting his stillness. This reversal also transformed the emotional atmosphere. Fear had previously radiated from the foreman outward, pressing down on the workers. Now uncertainty radiated from him instead. He could not shout at the wolf. He could not command it. He could not publicly shame it. His usual tools of dominance were useless against something that did not recognize his authority. The moment exposed a truth, often hidden in rigid hierarchies. Power maintained through fear is dependent on uninterrupted performance. Once that performance is disrupted, even briefly, the foundation trembles. The wolf's silent stare accomplished what open rebellion could not in that instant. It forced the foreman into stillness, stripping him of theatrical control in front of witnesses. When the wolf finally turned and walked back into the woods, the field did not return to its previous balance immediately. Something intangible had shifted. The workers had seen authority falter. The foreman had felt himself observed rather than obeyed. Though no laws changed and no chains were removed, the memory of that reversal lingered, proof that even the most rigid power structures can fracture under unexpected pressure. The foreman's dominance had always seemed absolute, built on intimidation, cruelty, and the unquestioned acceptance of others' fear. He had spent years conditioning the enslaved workers to respond to him with submission. Every word, every gesture, every lash reinforced a persona of authority that few dared challenge. But in that moment, facing the wolf, his carefully constructed image began to crumble. What had once been unquestioned control was suddenly vulnerable. He realized, almost instantly, that the rules he relied upon no longer applied. The animal before him recognized no titles, no plantation hierarchy, no human codes of submission. It did not flinch, step back, or acknowledge his authority in any way. The foreman's usual power, loud voice, aggressive posture, the threat of punishment, held no sway over this alpha. The realization struck him sharply for the first time. His dominance was not just challenged, it was irrelevant. The uncertainty showed in his body. His hand, previously raised to intimidate the elderly woman, slowly lowered. His chest no longer expanded with forced confidence. Even his eyes, which had once scanned the field to assert control, darted nervously as he measured the wolf. For the first time, he was not directing fear, he was experiencing it. His authority had been built on the compliance of others, and now compliance could not be assumed. The workers immediately sensed this shift. The one who had been a figure of unshakable power now appeared fallible. Where they had once trembled under his voice, now they watched him hesitate. The tables had turned emotionally, if not physically. The foreman had always used psychological dominance as a weapon, but now that weapon had been rendered ineffective by a presence beyond his control. The fragility of his authority became apparent to all. The psychological impact on the foreman likely intensified as he realized that any further attempt to assert control could provoke the wolf. Unlike human subjects, this creature's responses were unpredictable, grounded in instinct rather than fear of punishment. The foreman's usual tactics, shouting, posturing, threatening, were meaningless. For the first time, he had no strategy that guaranteed compliance, and that lack of control was disorienting. In that moment, the foreman's dominance was not just interrupted, it was questioned publicly. His role as the enforcer of fear, the one who dictated submission and punished disobedience, was undermined in front of the entire field. The witnesses saw the imbalance. The spectacle that had been intended to reinforce hierarchy instead revealed vulnerability. Authority was no longer absolute. It could falter, even crumble, in the presence of a force it could not command. By the time the wolf retreated, the foreman had changed. Whether he recognized it or not, he had experienced the limits of his own power. He had faced a being whose strength, calmness, and instinct did not conform to the rules he had spent years enforcing. The encounter left him restrained, cautious, and silent in ways the field had never seen before. His authority had survived, but its edge was dulled, and everyone, the workers, the woman, even he himself, knew it. The presence of the wolf created a striking contrast between human cruelty and animal instinct. The foreman's authority had relied on coercion, punishment, and manipulation, all behaviors learned and maintained through cultural and social systems. The wolf, on the other hand, operated purely on instinct, experience, and natural hierarchy within its own pack. It did not need to shout, strike, or humiliate to assert dominance. Its very posture, gaze, and movement conveyed control. This juxtaposition highlighted how deeply flawed and artificial the plantation system of power really was. The wolf's instincts were precise and measured. Every step it took was deliberate, every glance calculated to assess threat without unnecessary aggression. Unlike humans who often rely on loud, displays to command obedience. The wolf's authority came from calm confidence and awareness of its environment. It did not need to strike to be feared. The foreman, despite his outward aggression, depended on fear that could be challenged or manipulated, fear that could crumble when confronted by something primal and uncompromising. Human cruelty often depends on repetition and social reinforcement. The foreman had trained the field to respond to shame, to anticipate his moods, and to obey out of survival. Animal instinct operates differently. It reacts in the moment, responding directly to threat, challenge, or opportunity. The wolf did not hold grudges, nor did it require witnesses to validate its power. Its authority was immediate, natural, and absolute, grounded in survival rather than tradition or social approval. This encounter revealed an unsettling truth to the witnesses. Systems of cruelty are dependent on perception and control, whereas natural authority does not rely on manipulation. The foreman's power could be undermined if he faltered, if fear was absent, if circumstances changed. The wolf's instinctive dominance could not be negotiated or ignored. Its appearance exposed the fragility of human-imposed hierarchies when faced with a force that existed beyond their rules. The contrast also struck on a symbolic level. Human cruelty is often calculated, seeking to break spirits, isolate individuals, and maintain order through psychological and physical pressure. The wolf's behavior, in contrast, enforced boundaries without malice, without ego, without need for justification. Its instinctive action protected and restored balance in a way the plantation never could. The elders and younger workers could sense the difference intuitively, even if they could not articulate it. The tension between human cruelty and animal instinct emphasized the limits of control. No matter how loud the foreman shouted, no matter how many he humiliated, he could not dictate the wolf's behavior. Nature remained sovereign. For a brief, extraordinary moment, the wolf demonstrated that instinctual authority can rival, and even surpass, constructed human dominance, challenging the very foundation of fear-based power. Finally, the encounter suggested something deeper. Human systems that rely on oppression and intimidation are inherently unstable. They may function for years, decades even, but they exist within rules that can be interrupted. Animal instinct, in its pure form, operates outside those rules. The foreman's cruelty was a learned pattern. The wolf's behavior was innate. And in that instant, the workers and the elderly woman witnessed the undeniable difference, the stark, almost spiritual gap between a world built on exploitation and one guided by instinctive, unshakable natural law. The presence of the wolf also carried a deeper, almost spiritual resonance for those who witnessed it. In many African and American traditions, animals were not merely creatures of flesh and fur. They were messengers, guardians, or symbols of forces beyond human understanding. The elders and the workers may not have used words like omen or spirit, but instinctively they recognized that something extraordinary had entered their midst. This was not just an animal. It was a presence that demanded respect and attention. For the enslaved workers, life had taught them to look for signs and warnings in subtle cues. A change in the wind, an animal's unusual behavior, or a sudden silence in nature could indicate danger or protection. The wolf's emergence at the exact moment the elderly woman was being humiliated made it feel intentional, almost guided by unseen hands. In their eyes, it was as if nature itself had intervened to restore balance, delivering justice where human systems had failed completely. The timing of the wolf's appearance reinforced its symbolic power. It arrived not before the humiliation began, nor after it had ended, but at the precise moment tension reached its peak. That made its intervention feel like a response, an acknowledgement of suffering, or even an act of guardianship. The workers would have sensed that this was no ordinary encounter. It was a moment imbued with meaning, a warning to those who wielded power irresponsibly. Spiritual interpretations likely shaped how the incident was remembered and retold. Even in secrecy, whispers among the workers would have framed the wolf as a protector, a reminder that cruelty could attract forces beyond human reckoning. Stories passed along in hushed tones at night, shared in the safety of cabins or behind barns, would have preserved this encounter. As more than a simple animal sighting, it became legend, a narrative blending natural events with moral and spiritual lessons. The elderly woman herself may have felt a connection to the wolf that transcended fear. Her years of suffering had left her attuned to danger, yet she also carried knowledge of survival and perhaps even belief in the unseen forces that protect the vulnerable. The wolf's positioning between her and the foreman may have felt like recognition, a validation of her endurance, and a subtle promise that she was not alone against oppression. The spiritual lens also affected the foreman, though likely in a different way. The wolf's silent, unwavering gaze disrupted his sense of control and may have left him unsettled, aware that he faced a presence that defied his authority. For those attuned to signs and omens, this suggested that cruelty could summon consequences beyond human retribution, forces that operated according to laws outside plantation hierarchies. Ultimately, the encounter served as a reminder that life on the plantation existed alongside larger, unseen frameworks. Fear and domination governed human interactions, but nature and spirit remained beyond control. The wolf became more than an animal. It became a symbol of protection, balance, and the mysterious justice that could intervene when human cruelty reached its height. In the minds and hearts of those who witnessed it, the wolf's presence was a signal that moral order, though often invisible, was never entirely absent. The encounter with the wolf left a lasting mark on the behavior of everyone on the plantation. Before that day, the foreman's authority had been unchallenged, maintained through intimidation and public humiliation. Workers moved with measured steps, lowering their eyes and holding their silence to avoid becoming the next target. After the wolf appeared, however, even small gestures of fear or submission were altered, subtly reflecting a newfound awareness that dominance could be questioned in unexpected ways. The foreman himself changed his approach almost immediately. He no longer raised his voice as aggressively toward the elderly woman, nor did he attempt to force compliance through theatrical intimidation. His gestures became measured, cautious, and restrained, as though he carried the memory of the wolf's steady, unyielding gaze with him. The plantation hierarchy remained intact in form, but the edges of his authority were softened, and the workers could sense the difference. Among the enslaved workers, the shift was more psychological than structural. The field, once dominated by constant fear, now held a tension laced with hope. They had witnessed the fragility of enforced authority and understood that power could be interrupted, even by forces outside human comprehension. That realization did not immediately dismantle the hierarchy, but it allowed them to imagine possibilities beyond mere submission. Even the younger workers who had been observing the elderly woman learned a lesson in resilience. They saw that endurance and composure, combined with timing and external forces beyond the oppressor's control, could alter outcomes. The incident demonstrated that visible courage, when paired with unexpected intervention, could protect the vulnerable and subtly shift social dynamics, even in a tightly controlled environment. Behavior in the days following the encounter also reflected caution on both sides. The foreman avoided direct confrontation, especially with the elderly woman. He learned to pick his battles more carefully, understanding that overt cruelty could invite consequences he could not predict. The workers, in turn, remained vigilant, interpreting every shadow or sound with heightened awareness, knowing that the natural world could, in ways mysterious or symbolic, intervene. The incident became a reference point, silently acknowledged whenever tension rose in the fields. Stories circulated quietly, passed from person to person, reminding everyone that the foreman's power was not absolute. The memory of the wolf, its positioning, and the timing of its appearance served as a subtle moral compass, influencing choices, actions, and interactions long after the animal itself had disappeared into the woods. Over time, this shift in behavior reinforced a sense of balance that had been previously absent. The plantation continued to operate under the same outward rules, but the psychological landscape had changed. Fear still existed, but it was tempered by the knowledge that authority could falter. The workers and the elderly woman carried this awareness with them, quietly strengthening their sense of agency and preserving the lesson that even in the harshest conditions, dominance could be questioned and human dignity, in small ways, defended. The story of the wolf and the elderly woman did not fade with the passing of days. It became legend, whispered quietly among the enslaved and later retold across generations. The workers who witnessed it knew that what they had seen was extraordinary, an intersection of human suffering, natural power, and something almost mystical. In telling the story, they preserved not just an event, but a lesson about courage, survival, and the unexpected ways justice can manifest. As the tale circulated, it took on symbolic weight. The wolf was no longer merely an animal. It became a protector, a guardian figure, and a reminder that forces beyond human cruelty existed. The elderly woman's endurance was magnified through the story, her quiet resistance elevated into an emblem of dignity and resilience. In the retelling, she was not just a victim of oppression, but a figure whose strength commanded respect, even from forces as primal and imposing as an alpha wolf. The legend also served as a moral compass for the community. It reinforced values of courage, attentiveness, and respect for nature. Young workers learned that defiance did not always have to be loud or violent. Sometimes, quiet endurance and awareness could summon protection in ways they could not fully understand. The story became a subtle guide for navigating the dangers and injustices of daily life on the plantation. For the foreman and those in positions of power, The story spread more cautiously, often as a warning rather than entertainment. It was a reminder that authority, built on fear, was vulnerable to forces beyond human comprehension. Even the suggestion that such an event could occur undermined his aura of invincibility, reinforcing the lesson that power is never absolute and must always contend with unpredictability. Over time, the wolf's intervention became a symbol in oral history for the possibility of unseen justice. It taught that cruelty does not go unnoticed, and that the natural world, or perhaps a higher moral order, can intervene when human systems fail. Listeners, both enslaved and free, internalized this lesson as a mixture of hope and caution, understanding that life's balance can be restored in unexpected ways. The story also provided psychological comfort. For those living under constant oppression, it affirmed that the world held mechanisms of protection that could appear when most needed. Even if the actual wolf was gone, the narrative gave strength. The elderly woman's survival, and the wolf's presence as a shield, became a mental talisman for courage, a story to cling to when facing daily injustices that seemed insurmountable. Ultimately, the legend endured because it combined truth, symbolism, and moral teaching. It preserved the memory of an extraordinary moment where fear was confronted, dignity was quietly defended, and nature intervened in a human story of cruelty. The tale of the foreman, the elderly woman, and the alpha wolf became more than a single event. It became a living story, a testament to resilience, the limits of oppression, and the enduring possibility of justice in a world often ruled by fear.